As you might imagine, the time surrounding the arrest and trial of Jesus was a pretty tense and confusing time for the disciples. It seems like whenever the leader of a movement gets apprehended or taken out, the followers of that movement always tend to be fractured and a little directionless. Sometimes the movement even loses cohesion and starts to drift apart. In the case of the fledgling Jesus movement, most of the disciples stayed close and did a good bit of hiding. It became dangerous to be associated with Jesus and his mission during the intensity of what happened after his arrest. As Jesus the prisoner was shuffled around from place to place, a few of the disciples shadowed him, and among those was the impetuous Peter. We have the benefit of hindsight now to see that Peter would eventually go on to embody his foundational identity that Jesus gave him. Upon this rock I will build my church. But during those confusing and scary hours before Jesus was crucified, he was the hothead disciple, given to sticking his foot in his mouth and acting before he was doing a whole lot of thinking. It seems like it was precisely this personality that put him in the situation of making his famous denial in the first place, creeping around the courtyard of the high priest and warming himself by the fire in public during the trial of Jesus before the high priest. It was brave, but it wasn't the smartest thing he could have done. Inevitably, he was going to be recognized, and his personality probably wasn't the least of the reasons why. 3 times he gets asked if he's with Jesus. I imagine the first time being like a fluke. It's just a moment in time. It's a random question. Surely not something that'll be remembered the next day, much less over 2,000 years later. The second time is annoying and a bit unnerving. He wonders how many other people recognize him. Soldiers, informants. He's got to deny association to protect himself and the other disciples. And the third time is almost iconic. It almost just cements the action into the collective meaning of the story, that when the chips are down and our feet are held to the fire, we're pretty much going to say or do anything we have to say or do to protect ourselves. Suddenly, following Jesus was about life or death. And if it was all the same to Peter, he would just as soon live. How else was the message of Jesus going to survive unless there were disciples that survived too? I've heard tons of sermons about how faithless Peter was in this moment. How could he have spent so much time with Jesus, the Messiah, and then deny him 3 times? Jesus actually predicts his denial, and so one has to wonder what kind of head trip that was. When the Messiah tells you that you'll deny him, what kind of say do you really have in the matter? That all gets way too confusing and philosophical for me. What I do know is that stressful situations generally tend to bring out the essence of our personalities. How we deal with tense and stressful situations can say a lot about who we are as people. My wife has this fantastic ability to be very calm, cool, collected, and stressful emergency type situations. She's fantastic to have around if someone has been injured or something unexpected and bad happens. She gets this clarity and calmness about her that is immensely comforting and helpful. And my parents had a similar approach to situations like that. I remember this one particular time when I was a teenager. I was never very rebellious or mischievous, but I'd gotten myself in over my head in a situation that came to light in a very public and embarrassing way. I'll spare you the details, but I fully expected my parents to come down really hard on me and be extremely upset. The emotional weight of it was pretty heavy, and I ended up just kind of crumpled on the floor of our family living room with all the weight of my teenage mistakes collapsing on me. And then something happened that I don't think I'll ever forget. My mom and my dad got down on the floor next to me. They put their arms around me, and they started to share with me how they had both been in similar situations. They got down on my level and revealed their own humanity to me. And even though I was awash in tears and embarrassment and shame, I immediately began to feel this flicker of restoration. That was the point in my life where my parents transitioned from authority figures who had to be obeyed because they said so to role models who I knew it was in my best interest to imitate. All of the lessons of obedience and authority found their fulfillment in that moment of vulnerability and grace and reconciliation. Peter and all of the disciples, for that matter, were shell-shocked after everything that happened with Jesus. They had been following this unusual and unorthodox rabbi for a few short, intense years, and everything about their lives had changed. They all thought their chances to be disciples of a true rabbi had come and gone years ago. They'd all accepted the fact that their lives were going to consist of the family trade and day in, day out life to make ends meet and take care of their families. But then came Jesus. They tried so hard to understand. They gave everything about themselves to this man and his mission. They struggled and misunderstood often, but who didn't? And who still doesn't? Can you imagine what the conversation on the boat must have been like that morning as they were fishing? Do you remember when Jesus would tell us a story and teach us something, and we would just all stare at him without a clue what he had said? I can hear him now. Do you still not understand? And do you remember when we fought that storm all night out here and we thought we had seen a ghost walking towards us on the water, and then Jesus called Peter. And they all looked at Peter, who was still despondent. He was just covered in guilt from what had happened, going through the motions of fishing that morning, catching no fish at all. I mean, he didn't even look up. And just then, a voice rang out from the shore. "Children, have you caught anything?" And they answered, "No." And the voice came back, "Well, cast out on the other side." They'd been fishing all night, and I guess it was a last-ditch effort, and they put out the net on the other side of the boat and suddenly found it was so full that they couldn't pull it back in. And John, taking Peter by the shoulders and getting his attention, looking him right in the eyes, says, "It's the Lord." Before he could get the words out of his mouth, Peter was scrambling for his clothes, and he was over the side of the boat on the way to the shore. I often wonder what went through Peter's head on that 100-yard swim. I wonder if he was worried about what Jesus would say. I wonder if he was worried about how Jesus would react. Would he be ashamed or angry? Well, he finally gets there, and so do the rest of the disciples with the boat. And we'll never know what that conversation was like between them and Jesus as they ate a fresh fish breakfast, and I'm almost happy that the moment was kept private. Jesus already had fish cooking before they pulled up, so obviously he had been fishing and knew where all the fish were to be caught. After they'd eaten as much as they wanted, Jesus breaks the ice with Peter. "Do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." "Then feed my sheep." 2 more times, Jesus asks them this question. Once for each time he denied, like he was carefully erasing Peter's guilt. And each time he comes back, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." And the last time, confused and with a little bit of hurt feelings, "Lord, you know everything. You already know that I love you." And he was right. Jesus did know. See, he wasn't asking because he needed to hear it from Peter. He was asking because Peter needed to hear it from himself. In each reaffirmation of Peter's love, Jesus was getting on his level, lifting him up, restoring him to wholeness in the revelation of his love in Peter. And in my heart, I hear these echoes of 1 John 4. This is how love is made complete among us, so that we will have confidence on the day of judgment. In this world, we are like Jesus. There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. Brothers and sisters, we love because he first loved us. In confessing his love for Jesus 3 times, once for each time he denied, Peter was being gently and skillfully reminded and reassured of Jesus' never-ending love for him. Perfect love drives out fear. And in the absence of fear and in the absence of guilt, God's love in Jesus raises us up on our feet, where we belong, to inherit our sonship and our daughtership. We come out of the tomb with Jesus, raised to walk in a new life that is realized inside of us, that is the very life of the Christ of God. That morning, Peter walked away from the beach and stepped into history as one of the very foundations of the Christian movement on earth. Indeed, the institution of the church, for better or worse, exists because Peter was restored by the perfect love of God through his encounter with Jesus. It was a pretty important fish breakfast. So where is it that you encounter Jesus? Where are your wounds? Where is your guilt heaped up and kept? It's my deep joy to tell you that the love of God is close to your wounds, close to your mistakes and your guilt and your shame. The very things we try so hard to hide, the qualities we attempt to shove down and put away, are the qualities Jesus wraps his arms around and says, I know it hurts. I know you're afraid. And I know what the crushing guilt feels like. And he takes your face in his hands and catches your eyes and says, do you love me? Not because he doesn't know, but because your answer shows you, just like it did Peter, that perfect love casts out fear, that you are made complete in the love of God. So open up your wounds. Let them touch the wounds of Jesus. Open up your heart and be restored and feed his sheep. Amen.